There she is. There's that voice we've come to know and love. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you again for coming out in such rubbish January weather. It'll be much better in February and March. You'll be aware that through the course of this and previous programs, we've dipped into, in no particular chronological order or chronostratigraphic order, the various chapters in that are in the forthcoming new edition of the Geology of Scotland. So tonight, in a sense, we're sticking with that non-conformist approach to the geological record, and we're going back to really rather to the beginning in many ways. And so it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome Adrian Shaw, who is going to talk to us about his research into the reaction to Hutton and his contemporaries, but Hutton's work, and particularly the publication of the Theory of the Earth, 1785, and how that was reacted to by the Church of Scotland, ministers and the community of the Church of Scotland, in that particularly rich resource that is the archives of that organization and the various essays and so on, which were written, over 900 of them, did you say?
Yes.
At the time. So there's a huge wealth of response. It makes me wonder what the world would have been like, or what at that time, if they'd had social media, and how things would have exploded or developed around the discussions of that time in that modern medium. Maybe it's best we don't go there. So tonight, Adrian has for a long time been climate change officer for the Church of Scotland, and has crossed that, not division or boundary, but demarcation, I suppose, between science and faith and science, and worked in both of those regions in his career. And so he's very well placed to talk about the response of that particular community, the church community at that time, to the beginnings, I suppose, of what we now see as geological science as we recognize it today. So, Adrian, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to start my clock so I don't overrun. I could get carried away talking about Hutton. Now, the machine is not moving. Technical assistance, please.
That happens again. Just click once.
There we go. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm very grateful for that, because it gives an opportunity and the challenge of trying to summarize 2 years of work give it some kind of structure. And as indicated, the whole purpose of this project is to explore how ministers in the Church of Scotland responded to James Hutton's Theory of the Earth. And what I'll do this evening is look at the context and say why this is significant, and then discuss the principal not exclusive source, I've used other materials, but the principal source of the statistical accounts of Scotland, and then discuss some of the findings that are coming out of this work. And you know very well about James Hutton and the Theory of the Earth, delivered in 1785 in 2 lectures to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, subsequently published in quite a substantial article in 1788 in the first volume of the Transactions of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and then subsequently expanded upon by further publications. And the importance of Hutton here indicated by this quote from the American Museum of Natural History, the founder of modern geology. And the significance of this, of course, and the importance of this is Hutton's essential belief that landforms are created not by some original creation event, but shaped by continuing natural forces, including erosion by water, deposition of material on the seabed, and uplift, and that such processes must necessarily operate over an immense period of time and are possibly without beginning or without end. That this blatantly contradicts any literal interpretation of the Bible, and I stress the word literal there. So why is this important? Just a couple of quotations here. The most recent biography of James Hutton by Ray Perman, in which he says the rejection of the biblical narrative, which held that the earth was a little over 6,000 years old, led to attacks on Hutton. But Hutton is looking into the chasm with no fear. He's prepared to accept this whole new interpretation of the earth. And just yesterday, visiting the Scottish Portrait Gallery, the picture that you saw at the beginning there, the little piece by the side of it, by the side of the picture says, his findings undermine traditional religious beliefs, provided most people with their moral and ethical principles. So clearly, this is important. This is significant, and we expect a reaction. And Hutton was certainly concerned about that. He had probably seen the reaction to Buffon's Époque de la Nature, published in 1778, where Buffon had said the earth was 75,000 years old. Buffon was censured by the Collège de Sorbonne in Paris for saying that and had to formally write back to them to apologize. So Hutton had prepared a short preface to the theory, which he thought he might include. But before doing that, he sent it to William Robertson, historian, principal of Edinburgh University, and said, well, what do you think about this? And Robertson advised against putting any theological introduction. Hutton took the advice. There is no theological preface to the theory. So the project I've been working on looks at the response. And I say at the outset, I'm trying to contain this, to look at the response by the clergy of the Church of Scotland in the immediate period following the publication, 15 years from 1785 to 1800. I'm not going out with Scotland. There were reactions from elsewhere, but containing it to within Scotland, and also stopping in as much as I can at 1800. The reason for stopping there is partly practical, to keep this manageable, but partly because there are so many developments in geology and theology in the early 19th century that it becomes a lot more complicated. And in the early decades of the 19th century, the emergence, the coming together of geology, paleontology, and other studies in creation theory creates a wholly more complicated one. So I'm stopping at 1800. So what evidence is there of shock or horror on the part of Church of Scotland ministers? It's useful to know a little bit about the politics of the Church of Scotland at this time. Two main factions in the church, the moderates and the Popular Party. In the second half of the 18th century, the moderates were in effective control of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Politically, they were quite conservative. They were opposed to the rebels in America. They were very much opposed to the French Revolution. Intellectually, rather liberal. But within the General Assembly, then as now, there tend to be quite noisy debates. And if Church of Scotland ministers were unhappy about something, they were not shy in saying so. So, for example, David Hume and Lord Kaimes, both heavily criticized by some ministers in the General Assembly, effectively called heretics. And John Hume, Church of Scotland minister, who wrote the play Douglas, which was performed in Edinburgh, to appall some members of the Popular Party. The point being that if Church of Scotland ministers had not approved, they would have said so. So then, how did the Church of Scotland's clergy respond? Going through the records of the General Assembly from 1780 to 1800 reveals precisely nothing. Hutton was not mentioned. There was no official mention of Hutton in the General Assembly. And I can find little evidence elsewhere of immediate reaction of shock or horror by Church of Scotland ministers. In fact, what we find is silence, which is quite frustrating when you're trying to dig into this. So we have to look elsewhere. And the first question we really have to ask, therefore, is, were ministers aware of the theory? Did they know anything about it, or was it not news to them? John Playfair, who made Hutton more famous through his illustrations of the Huttonian theory of the earth, 1802, suggested that the theory had been little known before then. That might have been Playfair, of course, trying to create space for his own publication, because others who've studied it, Dennis Dean, one of Hutton's biographers, Martin Rudwick, historian of science, disagree. They are both of the view that the theory was known and quite well discussed before John Playfair's illustrations of the Huttonian theory of the earth. Certainly it was reviewed in the Monthly Review, Analytical Review, and Critical Review in 1788. So important to establish these facts. And I think central to this is the role of the Royal Society and the place of Church of Scotland ministers within the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The theory launched in the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1785. The society itself had only been established formally in 1783. Over 20% of the initial foundation members were churchmen, including former moderators and professors from all the Scottish universities. Interesting also, Buffon, an honorary member. So it's clear that leading churchmen would have been aware of this. It's difficult to imagine that they didn't know about it. Certainly the RSE at that time, a center of discussion on the emerging natural sciences. And as it's that time of the year, I think we could slip Robert Burns into the conversation just for a minute. This painting by Hardy, done a century after the event, records the meeting in Sheen's house, just down the road. Robert Burns, on the left here, standing, and Walter Scott, a documented meeting where these two met. Edwin Morgan, who was a playwright and poet and macker, was convinced that Robert Burns knew of Hutton's theory and used Hutton's theory for one of his great love poems. My love is like a red, red rose, newly sprung in June. My love is like a melody, sweetly played in tune. So fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gan dry. Till all the seas gan dry, my dear, and rocks melt with the sun. I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life shall run. So fare thee well, my ain true love, fare thee well a while. I will come again, my love, though it were 10,000 mile. Now, it's earth science imagery, it's geological imagery that makes that poem so great. Edwin Morgan is convinced that Hutton is in part responsible for that. So look who else is in the room there, on the extreme left. Adam Ferguson, Church of Scotland minister. He was chaplain to the military, subsequently professor at Edinburgh University. Over here on the right, John Hume, Church of Scotland minister, poet, playwright. There, Hutton. And also in the room, Joseph Black, Adam Smith, Dougal Stewart. Also, interestingly, unmentioned, unnamed, two women in the room. We do not hear the voices of women in this debate. It's a major weakness, but I'm afraid it's all men. What we have here then is in miniature a microcosm of the literati of Edinburgh society, including scientists, churchmen, poets, writers. It's inconceivable really to me that the churchmen did not know about this. If they did know, why then did they remain silent? Why is it so difficult to get information on what they thought? A number of reasons are possible. Maybe they weren't interested. Maybe just weren't interested in natural history, science. Certainly, theories of the earth were not new. They'd been around for a century or more. And the empirical study of nature, natural history, or the theoretical study, natural philosophy, were activities the clergy may have been involved in. So in order to try and test out some of these ideas, where do we go for evidence? Theories of the earth before Hutton, for example. I just put these up by way of illustration. Descartes, 1644, theorizing that the earth was originally a star that cooled and formed. Two churchmen there from England, Thomas Burnet and William Whiston, both theorizing about the history of the earth. very serious attempts on their part to try and reconcile theology and science, to come to terms with the emerging science and say, how does this relate to Christian belief? And at the bottom again, just because it's so close to, in time to Hutton, Buffon, Époque de la Nature, saying the earth is 75,000 years old. Now, in many ways, he's a hero of mine. He was a giant of natural history world in the 18th century, probably along with Linnaeus, the two great figures of European natural history. Censured by the Sorbonne for this Époque de la Nature, 1778, but he was well known in Scotland. William Smellie, Edinburgh publisher, translated Buffon's multi-volume Histoire naturelle into English. And it was widely read. We know that from the records of Inner Pethray Library, a small village in Perthshire that had a lending library. And the records, the borrowing records of that library survive. And someone's been through and listed all the books in order, but the numbers of times they were borrowed. At the top was William Robertson's History. Number 5 in that list was the English translation of Buffon's Natural History. Now, if Buffon is known about in a small village in Perthshire, he certainly would have been known about in Edinburgh, hence his invitation to be honorary member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Natural history and natural philosophy. Some English examples here of how clergy in England were interested in this. Gilbert White, well known for the natural history and antiquities of Selborne, a clergyman naturalist, writing in detail and very elegantly about the natural history and antiquities of his parish. But at the top there, John Ray, a very serious contribution, again, thinking about the relationship between science and faith, a serious subject of discussion for him and others. So in Scotland, beginning to then try and focus on how do we explore what ministers were writing about the natural environment? What does this tell us about their interests and attitudes? Can it throw any light on what they might have thought of Hutton? The great source is the Statistical Account, which I think could be properly regarded as a genuine monument to the Scottish Enlightenment, co-created by Sir John Sinclair, the originator of the exercise, and ministers of the Church of Scotland who wrote the great majority of accounts. Sinclair thought about editing the contributions early on, but they came in so fast in so many different ways. Essentially, they were published verbatim, 938 essays between 1790 and 1797. Sinclair was a big figure in the UK government, driving force both behind statistical accounts and the county agricultural surveys. Sinclair had traveled around Europe following the death of his first wife. And in Germany, he came across, possibly in Hanover, this idea of statistic, meaning science of the state. He brought that concept back. The word statistic had occasionally been recorded in the English language before then, but it's Sinclair and the Statistical Account of Scotland that makes this word, this concept, widely known. Interesting to think, therefore, that Church of Scotland ministers and Sinclair were helping create a whole new style of statistical inquiry, the aim being to provide useful information for good government. As a source, tremendously rich, but not without difficulties. Not all written by Church of Scotland parish ministers, and the biggest gap we have are for the cities, because for the parishes in Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, the accounts were all compiled for the city and published anonymously, so we can't be sure who wrote them. So unfortunately, for Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, we can't really use that because we can't be sure that it was ministers that were writing them. Similarly, tremendously variable quality and length. Some of the accounts, 2 pages long, minister not interested, does the minimum, get by with, sends it off. In others, the minister really invests time and effort, more than 50 pages of detailed account of their parish. and environmental subjects are prominent. Why is this useful? Because they're written in the decade after Hutton's theory. So if ministers have something to say about this, it's likely to pop up in these accounts. Sinclair started off the exercise after the General Assembly in 1790. Immediately after the assembly, he wrote to all Church of Scotland ministers saying, I'd like you to write an account of your parish. He sent out a questionnaire. These are some of the subjects he suggested ministers write about it. He didn't get a very good response straight off, so he wrote again and again and again. He was nothing if not dogged. In all, over 30 letters requesting, requiring, begging, pleading, bullying. And in the end, he got most ministers to respond. Where he didn't, he often sent someone out, the statistical inquirers, a friend of the statistical accounts, to go out and write the account where the parish minister simply couldn't or wouldn't. What's the contents? I started the exercise by looking at some samples from different counties across Scotland, from the islands of Argyll in the west, Ayrshire, Lanarkshire, Lothian, and Berwickshire. Try and get a sample of different parishes in different places. I would very much like to do some more, but time is pressing. There were 49 parishes in total, stretching across Scotland. The average length, 16 pages, 400 lines of text on average. From those accounts, nearly 50% of the text is on environmental subjects. It surprised me just how much ministers were writing about the natural environment in these accounts. Just a couple of examples. This is a rural parish in Ayrshire, where the environmental subjects on the left, these are the paragraph headings that's included in the text. And the number beside that is the number of lines of text under each of those headings. Some subjects clearly are easy to see as being environmental: soil, climate, rivulets, trades, livestock, agriculture, plantations. Some, like miscellaneous observations, more difficult. You have to go into the text and read it and make a decision whether to include it or not. Other headings, typically population, ecclesiastical state, character of the people, and poverty, not environmental issues. Interesting that the minister here writing far more, about environmental issues than about poverty in the parish. Surprising, maybe, that the minister would do that, but this is the case. Can the world hear us now? Can people out with the room now hear us? Okay, thank you. Gorbals, urban parish, a newly created parish, taken away from Govan in order to accommodate the growing population of Glasgow that's spilling over the river at this time. There is some environmental discussion in this, along with other riparian parishes, a lot of discussion about the floods that were taking place in the 1780s. But the majority of that text, much more to do with the growing population and the new building. So in that urban parish, only 29% of the text is on environmental subjects. So that's, in a sense, two extremes there. I'm not going forward. Oh, there we are. Doing a quick keyword search of the accounts. They're all available online, by the way. You can Google Old Statistical Account. Edinburgh University has put them all online. This is a short summary of the number of accounts that mention particular words, so that, for example, 815 accounts include farming in there. Farming is, or agriculture is in most accounts. But just consider that second line for a second. 857 of the accounts, 91%, mention soil in the parish. I was musing to myself, I wonder how many Church of Scotland ministers today could write an account of the soil in their parish. It's a very different concept of things that ministers were interested in. And a range of other issues there people are interested in, landscape, trees, climate, and at the bottom, minerals. And I'm going to focus in just a bit on minerals today. 364 accounts use the word minerals in the text. Discussion of freestone, sandstone for building. 84 mention granite. 603 mention lime. The miracle manure of Scottish agriculture in the 18th century, so that lime is being applied to fields in farms in many places across Scotland, being used there to reduce the acidity of the soils, soil conditioner, allowing uptake of nutrients by plants, increasing yields, and increasing incomes of farms. So this use of lime is being recorded. Ministers were interested in it, no doubt, for scientific reasons, but also they were interested in it as its association with agricultural improvement. Peat at the bottom, 493. Peat is being primarily used as a fuel in areas coal is not available. Much less reference to individual writers. These statistical accounts were not academic papers. They were not referencing individual writers or sources, but you still get these names cropping up from time to time. Only one mention of James Hutton, and that's in the parish of Strayton, where the minister refers to the celebrated Dr. Hutton in relation to a geological interest he has. Far more mentions of Thomas Pennant, a traveller, a writer of guides to Scotland. Samuel Johnson thought Thomas Pennant was the best travel writer in the country. Thomas Pennant relied for a lot of his information on correspondence with Church of Scotland ministers. The two of them got on well together. Thomas Pennant thought ministers were well informed, and they thought his guidebooks were worth supporting. 3 mentions of James Ussher, the man who wrote this historical work, but not one of those 3 mentions refers to James Ussher saying the earth was 6,000 years old. I can find no reference to that so far in the accounts or any other contemporary source. Going to move on now just to look at some of the output from this, some of the writings of Church of Scotland ministers. Out of 900 accounts, there are, probably a couple of hundred that are really fascinating to read in relation to natural environment. These are some of the very best. Just to give you a flavour of what ministers were saying. Start up north with John Dunbar, Minister of Dyke and Moy and Murray. Substantial account, 43 pages, 1,047 lines. Over 50% of his text is on environmental themes. One of his great interests was the Marison Sandhills. He devotes 6 pages to a discussion of this. He notes the antiquity of the dunes, saying he can't find either in the literature or any discussions in the parish when the dunes were first there. They predate the records or the folk memory. He does quote historical accounts of how the dunes had caused inundation by sand. And he describes the movement of the dunes over time, how they're being pushed in response to the prevailing wind and the impact this has on the coastal geomorphology, changing the course of the river at Findhorn. He notes the impact on agriculture as being primarily negative, that when there's a good blow, the sand can cover the agriculture and can sterilize some of the fields. This, he believed, had contributed to the depopulation of Culbin. Robert Rennie, Kilsyth in Stirling, minister from 1789 to 1820, counting 99 pages. Normally, I would go in and count the lines. But when I saw it was 99 pages long, I just thought, oh, I'll put that aside for another day. That would be the better part of 3,000 lines of text. As he says himself, the mineralogy of this parish would fill a volume, and he goes into some detail describing the coal geology and the mining of coal, iron ore, limestone, petrified shells, fossils, the exploration for copper, copper being much in demand. Time 1790s, the Royal Navy needs copper to copper bottom its vessels. The occurrence of basalt, white freestone for building, petrified trees and coal stalks. He then goes on later, after formally and stopping this study 1800, it's impossible to ignore that his great fascination is for peat bogs. So by 1810, he's published a 3-volume study of peat bogs, their natural history and their utility, how they might be used as a soil improver, how they might be converted into a manure and other economical purposes. That must be one of the largest early studies of the natural history of peat bogs. James Meek, he was moderator, 1795, 34-page account from Cambuslang in Lanarkshire. He writes an outstanding description of the changes in agriculture. He really understands how the changes are taking place, and in particularly in Cambuslang, the impact that Glasgow is having. Glasgow in the 1790s is growing fast. Its economy is booming. It's sucking in resources from around the world, but it's having a big impact on the local landscape, on the growth of population, on the development of industry, and on agriculture. But his great interest is climatology. Over 20 years, he recorded daily observations of the weather, barometer readings, thermometer readings, wind direction, rainfall, and remarks. No doubt interested in it for its own sake, but again, he's interested in the implications for farming. He's linking the science to utilitarian outcome. The manuscript of those meteorological observations is now in Glasgow University Library. It survives. Charles McHardy, Crathy, Braemar, 540 lines, 50% of them on environmental subjects. He, along with many other ministers, notes that in the peat bogs in the parish, there are old tree stumps. It's quite a common observation. And he is linking this to the existence of a great northern Caledonian forest. The idea of a Caledonian forest is not new. It goes back to antiquity. But there's a minister here who's looking at the evidence and trees and saying, well, there's the evidence that the land must have had much higher level of forest cover than now. But look at that bullet point there. Vermin. Rewilding is a totally alien concept in the 18th century. Ministers are not interested in that. Extirpation of foxes, wildcats, polecats, eagles, and hawks. Right? Make people shudder today. Ministers are interested in the natural environment, but they have a very different set of interests and values to environmental interests of people today. Like some others, he notices the presence of snow patches throughout the year on the northern slopes in Cairngorms and elsewhere. But no minister that I've found connects that to geology and to erosion. Maybe nobody else had in Scotland at that time, awaiting the impact of Agassiz in the 19th century. In Ayrshire, James Woodrow, another very interesting minister. He is author of substantial correspondence, which is in the process of publication now, illuminating parish life and attitudes to a whole range of issues in the end of the 18th century. 40% of his substantial account on environmental subjects, interested in the coast, interested in mineralogy, ironstone, freestone, blackstone, and limestone. But what really gets him excited is coal mining. He has several different sections on it, looking at the geology of the coal strata. He's interested in how, what lies below the surface, looking at the exploitation of this, the late spirited efforts in working the coal mines, but also how this compares with other parts of Scotland and what is the extent of the coal geology across Scotland. He includes this illustration, a sketch of 11 seams of coal near Saltcoats engraved for Sir John Sinclair's Statistical Account of Scotland. So presumably this was drawn specifically for this account. And it's interesting in what it tells us. For example, we have here a cross-section, north on the left, south on the right, the pit in the middle, and it shows the seams of coal. It shows the thickness of them, the depth of them, and it shows the dip of the strata. I would be interested to learn more from you about the history of geological illustration. When did drawings like this emerge? Because it clearly shows an imagination, being able to think of the earth below the surface and how the earth is structured. Is this unusual, or are there other examples from this time? I'd like to shortcut the research by asking you about that. Now, just coming on finally to look at some of Hutton's ministerial critics. None of them mention Hutton by name, but some of the ministers who are writing, who we can infer are talking about Hutton, are among the most knowledgeable ministers and the most interested in the natural environment. John Walker, you may be familiar with. He was twin tracking. He was a minister in Collington and also professor of natural history in Edinburgh for 1779. His account is quite straightforward, quite short compared to some, only 34% on environmental themes. But looking at some of his other writings, it's clear that he had reservations about the approach of James Hutton. I love the wording of it. The method of inquiry which our ingenious theorists of the earth have pursued is certainly erroneous. So he's talking about theorists in the plural. Hutton, Buffon, maybe others. They first form a hypothesis to solve the phenomena. The phenomena always used as a prop to the hypothesis. He, John Walker, much prefers to content himself with establishing facts. Observation and experiment, really, to Walker are everything. That's the method that may lead us through the mazes of the subject. A manifesto for empiricism. Empirical research rather than theoretical research. Natural history rather than natural philosophy. William Bennett at Duddingston, in many ways a very attractive personality, 26-page account, 40% of it on environmental themes, 126 lines on minerals, vegetables, and animals. He claimed to have identified over 400 species of plant on Arthur's Seat. He thought the Flora Scotica, Lightfoot had written, was inadequate. He thought there were more species than Lightfoot was prepared to accept. He was really interested in aquatic flora. He went into Duddingston Loch and listed 30 species of aquatic flora, listing them using the Linnaean system. He also included in his parish the front at Portobello. At Portobello, he notes curious and rare specimens of petrified plants and trees have been found. Fossils, now known to be indigenous in tropical regions only, a circumstance which has given rise to so much ingenious speculation and so many extravagant theories. So he's interested in fossils. He's fascinated by what they are, but there's a question there. Why, if they are close to tropical regions in design, why are they in Portobello? He can't explain that, but he's skeptical about some of the theories designed to explain this. Bennett, he was an interesting man, as I said. The minister at Duddingston today, Jim Jack, told me a bit more about him. He tried to grow tropical fruits against the wall of the manse. Sadly, he died in the loch. It wasn't looking for flora. The folk memory in the parish is he ended his own life in the loch. The loch that he loved was where he died. It's a rather tragic end to an interesting life. Patrick Graham of Aberfoyle. He is a very interesting minister. 18-page account, 67% of it on environmental themes. He's fascinated by the topography, by the mountains, by erosion. He talks about birds and plants, he lists them, but really his interest is in evolution of the landscape. And he observes what's happening in the landscape in his parish and in other areas in the Highlands. And he's questioning whether Hutton's assertion that water is responsible for shaping the landscape is possible. Looking at it, says there's simply not enough power, not enough energy in the rivers and burns in the parish to shift the material. The truth seems to be the effects of it to be attributed to running water have always been proportionately small. He goes on and writes another account early in the 19th century, a visitor guide to Perthshire, and there he expands on this subject. And it's clear in that he refers to De Luc, one of Hutton's correspondents and one of Hutton's critics. De Luc saying that the water coming off the mountains has its material in it, it fills up the lochs, but the lochs are still not full. How can he say that this is sufficient power to erode the earth and take this stuff out to sea? It can't even fill the lochs in the Highlands. Like De Luc, he believes in a great event in the past that separated old geology from new geology. He believed that great event to be the flood. But if you substitute ice age for the flood, there's a lot of sense to what Patrick Graham is saying. His objections to Hutton are not theological. They're based on a reasonable observation that he does not think there's sufficient energy in the rivers to do what Hutton says it can do. And finally, David Ure, assistant minister at East Kilbride, 1783, 1790. He wasn't offered the job in 1790. He subsequently went on to work for James Sinclair, John Sinclair, helping to edit the accounts. And he finally became parish minister at Uphall. He's been called the father of Scottish paleontology. He was one of the first people to draw fossils. And he refers in his account to some of that, but he develops this again in this book, The History of Rutherglen and East Kilbride, with a view to promote study of antiquity and natural history, 1793. His collection of fossils is now in the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. The more inquiries we make, unbiased by theories, the greater number of facts that are undisguisedly related, the more able surely will mankind be to discover the phenomena by which the globe of the earth was thrown into its present state. And I took a little bit more from that text for you. These remains of the ancient ocean become highly interesting when we consider them as furnishing us undeniable proof the earth at some remote period underwent a very great change. He's aware of the antiquity of the earth. He's aware that very great changes have happened in the past. It is almost certain most of them lived and died in the places where now found, and that these places once covered by sea. So maybe a Neptunian theory there. From this view of them, plausible theories of the earth have been formed, a multiplicity of arguments drawn to illustrate the causes by which the great revolutions of the earth were brought about. Facts are daily occurring which stand in opposition to most of these theories and show them to have been too hastily made. As with the other ministers, we're finding this interest and support for empirical research, but a great skepticism about the theories. And that is a theme that is emerging from the accounts. I'm going to wrap this up shortly, just with some, I call them interim findings on the methodology. The first is the most obvious, that if you're interested in history of geology, history of geomorphology, natural history generally, the statistical accounts contain so much information that will be of interest. They're all there online, easy to dig into and download. but that the accounts do hold up this mirror to the interests and attitudes and values of Church of Scotland ministers and tell us a lot about what they were thinking, what interested them in the natural environment. It's clear that ministers, many hundred ministers, were interested in this, and some were deeply knowledgeable about the natural environment. But there's really not sufficient there, I think, to be conclusive on ministers' attitudes towards Hutton. You can suggest the critical interest, but it's a fairly limited amount of information. What can we say then about ministers' attitudes towards Earth history? Firstly, no one mentions Ussher. I cannot find a single minister who believes that the Earth was just 6,000 years old. If there is information out there, hopefully I'll be able to find it, but I think it's unlikely that by the 1790s ministers were still clinging to that idea. It had gone some time before. The accounts suggest many ministers accepted that landscapes had changed over time, possibly over a very long period of time, with coastlines, former forests, fossils, etc. But fossils present this dilemma because ministers are examining them, they're drawing them, they're fascinated by them. Where did they come from? How did they get there? I can't find any minister at this time who can explain that. Definitely ministers are interested in empirical science, much less convinced by theoretical speculation. But a lot of their interest and their research driven by this strong belief in improvement. For improvement today, we might say progress, but it really meant more. It meant moral improvement as well as economic improvement at that time. Agriculture was generating more money, but it was also beautifying the landscape, and other developments were also associated with improvement. And I just throw in this line at the bottom, which is not really related, but it's reading these accounts. We can see that ministers were interested in and supportive of the developing carbon economy. The carbon economy goes back before this time. Coal was being mined long before the 1790s, but it's expanding rapidly at this time with the increasing use of steam engines, the iron industry, etc. Also in agriculture, the move in agriculture from organic manure, the farmyard manure, clearing the byre, to mineral manures in terms of lime and marl. Ministers were witnessing this process of transformation of the economy. And this, to a certain extent, throws light on our predicament today. I'm going to stop there, Chair. I'd be delighted if anybody has questions.